once again, welcome to Christchurch. This is how we do things here.
Thanks for the invitation for a fight. I was just thinking as you were talking, it's a long time since I've had a fight. I've become a bit averse to it, somewhat. I manage a program of violence and trauma studies at AUT University, and 95% of the students are women coming to mainly look at how they can improve their services. So I just want to say, so that's how I've become averse to fighting. Actually, I know my odds. So it's really great to see so many guys in the room here, because I love working with guys. I love talking with guys, and actually I think the work has to be done with men, has to be done by guys. Yes. There's an absolutely different dynamic that takes place when men help men. The man doing the helping is doing the healing as well as the one who's being helped. And if it turns into, and sometimes it has to, women helping men, the problem is it reenacts an old dynamic that actually I think is part of the problem of men being dependent on women. And there's a powerlessness in that I think is at the base of a lot of family violence. So, thank you also to women who are here today, because what I have found is that women can say things to women that I can't say. And that's because if I say it, it sounds like I might be having a bit of a moan and a grizzle. But if a woman says, well, what about men and what about this, which often happens in my classes, I go, hey, thanks for saying that, because other women hear it so much better. So thank you. I want to talk about men and shame. About 5-6 years ago, I had an American guy who was working with men come over and do a workshop. And one of the things we said over coffee afterwards was, he said to me, and it hit me like a brick, he said, if you're working with women, they want relationship and affection. If you're working with men, they want respect. And at that point it hit me that one of the things that we've been missing out on in our work was the vital function of men being respected, and the presence of shame as a destructive or potentially a creative force in working with guys. So men need respect, and I look at some of the programs that are being run for men, sometimes by women, and there's a particular style, the more deliberate style, and it's actually not based about men being respected or men's shame at all, and I think we've got improper treatment programs. Anyway, let me go on. I just want to mention these people who've been helpful to me: James Gilligan, psychiatrist in the States; Tony Webb, who did his PhD on shame out of University of Western Sydney; and Nathanson, who I'll talk to a bit later. Thanks. Shame is a particular sort of emotion. It's the only social emotion. By social emotion, I mean it comes as a result of people's interaction onto us and our desire to be approved by them, and if that disapproval is taken away, we feel some shame. The difference in this, I think, is like when I go into a supermarket and I look at the free-range eggs there, and I make a decision to buy the free-range eggs based on my beliefs, then if somebody catches me not eating free-range eggs, they could say to me, oh, I noticed these are not free-range eggs, and I'm likely to go more into a guilt response. But if I don't care about it, but I do care about my relationship with that other person, and they say, I noticed you're not eating free-range eggs, I'm likely to go into shame in order to still get approval from that relationship. Thanks. So guilt is more individual. It's when our own values are in conflict. So sometimes we feel guilt and shame together, and that's tricky when that happens, because it's very hard to sort those out. It just feels uncomfortable. Thanks. So we've got a continuum here of respect and dignity and mana, which is not totally respect, but it's as close as we can come to it. And over here, shame, and the Māori concept of whakamā, which is a bit bigger next than our notion of shame, and that it incorporates a more social aspect that involves guilt and unworthiness as well. And it may also cover the loss of ability to speak up or express yourself. And it's felt usually by the whole family, because if those bonds are intact. Thanks. So also to touch in on Samoan shame, and so that's ma'a. Okay, my apologies if I haven't got that right. It's about creating group, and it's used in community building and under a traditional application. It's incredibly powerful for keeping the group intact, as in if somebody goes off the rails, does a bad thing, then as a form of apology, there's a process of subjecting yourself to humility in front of that family's house, usually under a fine mat, under the whonga process. And there's a curious thing happens in that the family themselves will experience shame if they don't release the offender from shame. Fascinating process. We capture some of these in our current movement towards restorative justice. Thanks. So the place I'm coming from at the moment is authentic shame is actually healthy, because it builds connections and relationships and closeness. And Pākehā might find this idea more difficult than, say, more traditional cultures, because Pākehā tends to be more individual. But if you're respecting and holding important the notion of the collective or the group, then shame is a powerful process of maintaining that collective and group and holding people within that. And shame occurs if people step outside of that group. So there's a process of re-entry, and what I'm interested in is the process of re-entry into that group again. Shame can be used to pressure a person to do both negative and positive things. So I'm thinking gang members here can be shamed into doing bad things. So it's a powerful force, so let's remember it can be used for lots of things. The pathology around shame, or the problem around shame, is that when we don't show it, it takes us somewhere else, which it can be deep and dark. When we avoid owning shame or recognizing that we are in shame, and we try and mask it with something else, then we've got major problems here around negative or destructive behaviour. And I'm suggesting to you today that's at the base of most violence, men's violence particularly. So dangerous behaviour can result when shame's not shared. Shame is about increasing isolation by taking a person out of the collective or the group. That isolation is really dangerous because it's a basis of things such as suicide. So the enemy is isolation in this, and the solution is the collective and the sense of belonging to community or group or whānau. So just to keep tuning you into what shame is, have you ever been invited to sing in front of a group without alcohol? Probably, again, Pākehā will find this a little more difficult. There's more of a culture of doing this without self-consciousness in some of the other traditional cultures. The number one fear is public speaking, and that's about the fear of the shame of the performance. So you might like to think about where that fear of shame came from. Next. Shaming of boys and men. So men are supposed to have pride in their strength, their courage, social ability, knowledge, structural power, acquisition, physical skill, and you might think that 50 years of feminism's made a difference to this whole thing, but I don't think it has. I don't think it's made a lot of difference to guys, and I don't think it's made a lot of difference to women's respect for guys, because these are very often things that are on the list around choosing a male mate. So both men and women endorse this. Next. So what should we therefore hide if those other things are honourable and desirable? Well, we hide our sadness, our love, our grief, our pain, our weaknesses, mental or physical, our failure, we hide our fear, we hide our hurt and abuse. And when we're hiding those things, we're masking them. We're not being authentic. And the guts of what I have to say is about going to those things through the shame. Thanks. You've probably seen this one before. It's used a lot in anger management type programs. But what we've got here is the anger funnel. The idea behind this is the only emotion that men have full approval for expression. And I'm not talking about bad behaviour. I'm talking about the emotion of anger is anger. And the thing with anger is it's a power emotion and it's used to cover vulnerability. So we have the vulnerability of all those things I was talking about: anxiety, loneliness, sadness, shame, embarrassment, inadequacy, insecurity, pain, put into the top of the funnel here, and often repressed and suppressed with drugs and alcohol. And if you've only got one emotion that's you're fully given permission to express, and that's anger, it comes out as anger at the bottom here. When in fact, it's that stuff. So we may, if the person chooses, get some bad behaviour out of that, the violence, control, disrespect. And the thing is that in violence where there's a victim and a perpetrator, a result of a negative interaction where abuse takes place is that both are shamed. And this is something that's come to me slowly over the years, is the deep shaming that people have when they do a bad thing to other people. So this again makes it very important. Now, if we're not going to go somewhere open and authentic with that shame, then we'll repress it and we've got more isolation and we have a bit of a cycle taking place here, which is a man's life. So one of the things that's been taking place, I'm suggesting, is inappropriate treatment. Men have been treated for anger and bad behaviour, as in working cognitively to stop doing the bad behaviour, instead of shame. And we need to be looking at shame. And I'm going here to Tony Webb's work, who did his PhD out of Western Sydney. One of the things he did is go into prisons and work with shame with prisoners, and I'll show you some of that shortly. So, if men still gain respect and love and acceptance by being invulnerable, by being prepared to withdraw empathy in order to compete, and part of that's in terms of providing and part of that's in terms of protecting, we get acceptance and recognition by being expendable, and currently over the last 18 months we've been celebrating the expendability of the men who went to World War I in this country. They did that with honour, and we respect that, but that's how you get respect, by being expendable, by achievement and by their independence instead of a interdependence. So what does male vulnerability allow now? Well, there's a partial vulnerability with women and mothers because of that whole protective paradigm. And I'm interested in changes taking place in that. Men are getting more permission to cry. But the rules are, you cry after she's cried, and you don't cry much. That's the current situation. I learned this from my daughter. My daughter, I like to think she knows this stuff. She's been around me and heard me talking this stuff for years. First live-in relationship she had with her boyfriend. She was about 20. And so I'd have lunch with her about every second week. And I'd say, how's it going? How's the relationship? How's the flat? And so, great, wonderful, excellent. Until one day she said, oh, it's not going so well. Oh, what's the problem? Oh, well, that's my boyfriend. He's just so sad at the moment. And he's crying everywhere. Yeah. And I said, well, what's all that about? She said, oh, his mother died. Well, here we go, we're laughing about this stuff. But, and I said, well, that's a pretty good thing to be sad about. That's a pretty good thing to cry about. And she, yeah, it is. Yeah, so, well, this progressed. Next week it was, yeah, but he's still crying, and the week after, well, it's not going so good because he's just crying still. I said, well, his mum's really important to him, and this is, and like, he's just young, and this is a biggie. Anyway, about 3 months later, she said, when I asked her, she said, oh, we split up. I said, how come? Look, he was just crying all the time. So that sounds pretty ruthless, and I'd like to think my daughter's not like that. But that's just how it is, sort of, at the moment. And so your vulnerability is okay. I hear sometimes women saying, oh, it's cute, you cried. But not too much. It's okay to share vulnerability to men if they're on the same team and group, and we can use this in treatment programs. I think that's where it's really powerful, because it breaks male isolation. And one of the isolations that men have suffered from is a poor relationship with their own dad. That's where the sense of relating to other males comes from. And if that's been a difficult relationship, then the healing is coming together with other guys. Unfortunately, some men have been too shamed by men to share with men immediately, so they're actually terrified of groups. So men have been shamed in the culture, and they're just moving beyond a shaming story. I think at the moment some of the fighting that Ken related to is the fact that men are still shamed openly, often unconsciously, by other men and by women. And I was just talking to somebody about an antenatal group that they were attending, and the atmosphere in the antenatal group with the dads there of telling dumb dad stories to get a laugh, that's a shaming. So boys are being shamed in our schools through a gender-based system which gives boys low achievement. This is one that seems to have been forgotten over the last 4 or 5 years, but the fact is our boys are underachieving at every level in our education system, and still about the only subject that they achieve better in is physical education or physical matters. On my own campus, the health campus, the only place where there's a good concentration of men and a lot of graduates is in the sports programs. So in our universities, we have about 60% more female graduates than men. Women are better educated than men, and men are often shamed in terms of their language, because women do tend to have better language skills, and some of that may not be the education system, some of that may be neuroscience, but that's a tricky place to go to. But there's a shaming taking place here, and our boys seek other ways of getting respect if they're being shamed in that. So one of the questions I'll be asking the education system is, are you respecting the boys, or are you operating a shaming system here? Immature and hurt men shame other men to avoid their own shame, and in therapy men have been shamed for not being able to talk about feelings and so on. They're being treated for anger rather than shame, and that's shaming in itself. Oh dear.
2 minutes.
2 minutes.
Yeah. You
Next
can
one.
do it. You can do it.
Right. Now let's go to the next one. Next one. Okay.
These will be available for us though, won't they?
Okay, yep. And the next one. So this is an important one. Gilligan, this one hit me between the eyes when I read this. Violence occurs when people see no means of undoing or preventing their own humiliation except by humiliating others. Indeed, that is the underlying purpose of inflicting violence on others. And our whole family violence industry needs to go to this, look at it, and if you're working with men and also women, then if we go to this, then we've got a real foundation to make something different happen in this country, because for the last 20 years we've been doing stuff that is not working. The problem's getting worse. Instead, we're putting more money into stuff that doesn't work to try and make it work better. Yep. So, let's go through this. And again, through this. And through this. And through this. Okay, mask to avoiding shame, particularly like Nathan's compass. Let's go to the next one here, please. This is a really, really important thing. What Nathanson does, and what my friend Tony Webb and Oz does, is as a process in a prison, got people sitting around the circle, and he invites them to come sit in the shame spot here, which means actually we're not masking shame anymore. We're actually being upfront. I feel shamed. I was shamed. I am shamed by a particular thing or incident. And then, and in that moment of talking about shame, it draws a huge amount of empathy from the people around. We are actually empathically attracted to people who will talk about their shame. And but we have common masking devices of either attacking other people to cover our shame, or attacking ourselves, or hiding from other people, or hiding from ourselves. And I can go into detail on these, but the time is not going to permit me to. So I just suggest to you that you have a favoured position of going to when you feel shamed. I know my particular one is I'll tend to hide, I'll withdraw from circulation, or and find a place and lick my wounds or whatever. And by bringing this out, we enable a conscious changing of this behaviour to say, listen, I'm not going to isolate. This is an isolation continuum here. This is an attack continuum. Mostly what we're attracted to in this work to deal with is people who are openly being violent by attacking others to mask their shame, to alleviate themselves from that feeling of being humiliated. We also, through the drug and alcohol thing, we involved in attacking ourselves, or working obsessively in order to hide from ourselves. I feel I need to somehow bring this to a conclusion here, but I need to say perhaps that the people hiding shame develop a false self, which is presented. It's often with men about bravado and so on. That's about trying to get respect back. Going under that to the shame is what can take us to what it's about. So perhaps if we go right to the last, second to last slide here. Again, next. Right. Go back. Go back one before. Yeah. So one of the things we can do in terms of shame work is do that personalising and naming of shame. We can do that in child-family relationship stuff. What are the shaming patterns within a family? We can do it in counselling and divorce, separation. Huge amount of shame about not being able to be successful in a relationship. Going to the people who came to your wedding and saying we didn't make it. Making up a shame story to cover it, masking it with bravado perhaps. Mentoring between people of all ages is a great way of taking away shame. A lot of our boys have been so shamed by not having a dad around, being part of being in family fights, by mentoring draws and builds from another place on this. School discipline, conflict education, the whole thing about having an agenda of restoring respect to people who break the rules as opposed to further reducing them and shaming them. Restorative justice works with the shame of both the victim and the perpetrator. Anger management and family violence work, the one that I'm associated in at Mount Live, has integrated sessions on shame into this as a way of acknowledging what's sitting under a lot of the anger stuff here. Suicide prevention, drawing the shame stories out, and changing the culture away from fear of revealing things to talking about them and making it okay to talk about them. An interesting one was airline pilots were encouraged as part of a change in culture to tell their shame stories, or if they had an incident that they were ashamed of in terms of their work, to tell it, and without having any form of punishment or retribution. And as a result, greatly increased the safety of their work, as opposed to the hiding of these incidents, so that supposedly people didn't know they were happening. Drug and alcohol and addiction recovery work needs to be looking at shame. Our prisons and community corrections groups need to be looking at shame and working with shame. Releasing from prison, I could say a lot about the way shame systems, there's a shaming when you take somebody to prison, but there's also what happens inside is that an alternative respect system gets set up, and you need to be part of that respect system internally. You may get your respect back inside, but the problem is when you come out of that and are released, then you're back into that disrespecting or shaming system that you left. So the restoration from shame on release is actually probably going to have more effect in terms of not reoffending. Unfortunately, I have to speak now to stop there because of time, and I'll leave this for you online if you want to have a chat about this any further.